Good evening and welcome to the public lecture organized by the Center for Banking Studies of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka on the global economic situation, prospects and challenges for Asian developing countries. To deliver a lecture on this, this evening we have a very distinguished personality, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Dr. Ahluwalia has been a key figure in the Indian economic reform process in the last few decades. His lifetime service as a civil servant for reforming economic policy to achieve inclusive growth in India has been honored by the President of India, awarding him with Padma Vibhushan, which is India's second highest civilian award for exceptional and distinguished service. Ahluwalia obtained his BA Hons, a degree from the University of Delhi, and subsequently obtained MA in philosophy, politics, and economics, and also an MPhil in economics from the Oxford University. He has also been awarded a number of honorary degrees, including Doctor of Civil Law from the University of Oxford, Doctor of Science from the Indian Institute of Technology, and Doctor of Science from the Indian School of Mines. After graduating from the University of Oxford, he joined the World Bank in 1968 and was in charge of the Income Distribution Division of the World Bank's Development Research Center. In 1979, he returned to India to take up the position of Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance. His career as a civil servant in India included holding several senior positions, such as Special Secretary to the Prime Minister in 1988 and 1990, Commerce Secretary from 1999 to 1991, Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs in the Finance Ministry from 1991 to 1993, and finally, as the Finance Secretary, Minister of Finance, from 1993 to 1998. In 1998, he was appointed a member of the Planning Commission. In 2001, Dr. Ahluwalia was chosen by the board of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to be the first director of the Independent Evaluation Office, in which capacity he supervised several critical studies, particularly related to policies and activities of the IMF. In June 2004, he resigned from his position at the IMF to become the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission in India. During this period, he supervised the preparation of the 11th Plan and 12th Plan, geared towards reforms necessary for faster, more inclusive, and sustainable growth in the Indian economy. Dr. Ahluwalia has published a number of articles on various aspects of the Indian economy in academic journals. With that very brief introduction, I kindly invite Dr. Ahluwalia to make his presentation. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me say that it's a great honor to be invited to deliver this lecture on my visit to Sri Lanka. I was asked to speak about the global economic prospects, really from the perspective of developing countries, and also to have a little presentation. So I think you see that presentation. I believe it's even been distributed. So I may depart from the text here and there, but the tables, the one or two tables, they are reasonably firm. And with that introduction, let me now begin. You know, I think the general assessment about the global picture is quite well known. It's not particularly encouraging. We have a situation where growth in the industrialized countries has remained anemic pretty much since the financial crisis of 2008. And you know, the IMF has repeatedly projected a sort of imminent improvement, which is a reasonable thing for the IMF to do. After all, I mean, you know, they're meant to encourage people on what's possible. And the fact is that year after year, those projections have been proved to be over-optimistic. I mean, the actual outcomes have turned out to be somewhat worse than was originally projected. Much the same thing holds for the G20. Because since the financial crisis, the G20 have been subjecting the global economy to a lot of scrutiny, and they've, on various stages and times, undertaken to coordinate their own monetary policies in a way that hopefully will bring about a quicker resumption of growth. That hasn't happened. In the last year, the mood in industrialized countries, following the Brexit vote in the UK and the presidential election in the US, suggests a distinct move away from globalization. I mean, this was kind of evident earlier, but it's now much more officially seems to be endorsed. And I mean, in addition to that, there is concern about the possible increase in protectionism. And a more immediate thing is the possible impact of a return to higher interest rates, which in a world of global flows could transmit itself much more rapidly than an increase in protectionism would do. So these are the uncertainties. I thought that, in order to anchor the discussion, let's take a look at what some numbers tell us. Now, these numbers are taken from the from the IMF's World Economic Outlook database, which is publicly available. This, I think, is the October 2016 version. I've not given the data before 2012 because up to about 2008, everything was going wonderfully. And after 2008, I mean, it was a big jolt to the industrialized countries, but the developing countries seemed to be doing quite well. And that was the period when, I mean, one or two of the IMF's reports talked about possible decoupling. That is, that the developing countries have developed a momentum which would survive even if industrialized countries slowed down. Now, that changed quite substantially after the Eurozone crisis of 2011, and the figures that you have here allow you to track what happened since then. I mean, you've got the period 2012 to 2015, then you've got two separate years, 2016 and then 2017 as a projection, and then the IMF's projection for the last 4 years. So what do these tell us? I think what these tell us is that up to 2016, the growth rate's going down. I mean, in 2016, the global economy grew less than it did between 2012 and 2015. And of course, the IMF projection is that now there'll be an improvement. But we have to take that with a pinch of salt. Actually, if you go into the details, the IMF always has a range. And there's a tendency to put the more optimistic part of it forward. Within this, it's very interesting to see what's happening between the industrialized countries and the emerging economies. I mean, in essence, both the industrialized and the developing countries are growing slower than they did before 2015. But the world as a whole will grow faster. I mean, as you can see here, at least in the period 2018 to 2021, those are the bold numbers, the world is projected to grow at 3.7, which is much faster than 3.36 in the period 2012 to 2015. But the industrialized countries grow more slowly, 1.74 instead of 1.87. The emerging and developing countries also grow more slowly, 4.97 instead of 5.43. And the reason is that the weight of the faster growing developing countries is increasing. So the world is growing faster, although both components are growing slower, because the weight of the faster growing component has actually increased. That's an important feature that we need to look at. Now, one of the interesting things is that within all this, the average global growth of trade doesn't look good at all. And in fact, in 2016, for the first time, the growth rate of global trade fell below the growth rate of global GDP. Now, since trade is traditionally viewed as an important positive transmission mechanism which sort of spreads prosperity, the fact that global trade has slowed down doesn't look all that good. And more importantly, the IMF is clearly assuming that this will reverse itself and that in future global trade growth will grow higher than world trade, than world GDP growth. Now, it is this projection which, I mean, this was made before, certainly before the great fears of protectionist relapse surfaced. So this is an issue that one has to consider, that if there is a big increase in protectionism, how much of this would remain valid. Now, let's take another, this is the last table, so you don't have to concentrate on tables after this. Now, this thing is really telling us what's happening to the rates of investment. You know, investment rates are extremely important in any analysis of why growth takes place. Contemporary approaches to growth on the supply side focus not just on investment, but also on total factor productivity growth. So typically, a contemporary supply side decomposition of growth would say that growth is caused by a growth of capital, which is investment, a growth in labor adjusted for skills, and a growth in total factor productivity. And very often, you get a lot of focus that, you know, even if other things are not going well, you should be able to get a lot more bang for the buck by relying on a faster growth of total factor productivity. And, you know, to the extent to which certainly we in developing countries are very far from the productivity frontier, you could argue that there's a lot of unutilized potential. But it's important to keep in mind that, you know, the ability to generate faster growth in total factor productivity is not independent of the level of investment. I mean, in effect, the hypothesis I'm putting forward is that the two are closely interconnected. If you get a big increase in investment, that will directly impact growth, but more importantly, in many, many ways, an economy that has a higher rate of growth of investment actually brings about higher change in total factor productivity. So the two really go together. And when you look at it from that point of view, the big difference between Asia and Latin America comes out very strongly. Because if you look at these numbers, I mean, the industrialized countries have an investment rate of around 20% or so. If you look at all the emerging and developing countries together, they seem to have something of the order of 32% or so. But within this decomposition, if you look at emerging and developing Asia, then that investment rate is much higher. If we just focus on 2016, whereas all emerging and developing countries have an investment rate of, say, 32%, emerging and developing Asia has 39.7%, much higher. And actually, it was even higher before that, in the period 2010 to 2015. It was even higher because that was a period when China was having very high investment rate. Chinese investment rates have been pretty stratospheric. And I think they've been coming down as everybody predicted they would. So what you see in 2016 is a moderation of the Chinese investment rate, some slowdown also in the Indian investment rate, but nevertheless, it's an investment rate of 39.6%. Now compare that with Latin America, and you've got a Latin American investment rate of 21% and a sub-Saharan investment rate of below 20%. So when you look at the prospects for the developing countries, one of the reasons why in the previous table, Asian emerging, let me just go back once to see the, Asian emerging market, Asian emerging and developing countries, I mean, grew at 7.49% in the period 2012 to 15. They're slowing down, but they're still growing at 6.5%, 6.4%. Whereas the emerging markets as a whole, which includes Africa and Latin America, are growing at about 4.2, 4.6, and then rising to 5. So Asia growing much faster than the others, and in my view, that is quite powerfully explained by the fact that Asian countries have much higher rates of investment. Now, this is, of course, relevant when you look at the future. Now, looking forward, what are the policy lessons that we should draw? Now, before coming to the next slide, I mean, I thought of this only while thinking about the lecture, so I don't have a slide on this, so you'll have to follow my argument, and I'll go to the next slide thereafter. See, the key question we have to ask is, can developing countries accelerate their growth if industrialized countries are somehow stuck in a low-growth scenario? You know, the conventional view, and it's the view put forward in most international organizations also, is, and certainly the IMF, the World Bank, and G20 and so on, that really the developed countries have been the engines of growth, and this is very, very valid until very recently. And therefore, that engine has to revive a little bit for the rest of the economy to do well. So there is a kind of layering effect. That is, the benefits of the growth kind of slip down, not necessarily to all developing countries, but certainly to those developing countries that are able to link up with the faster growth of the developed countries and service the expanding markets of developing countries. This has been the traditional image that we've all worked on. Now, as I mentioned earlier, at one stage, sort of after the 2008 crisis, they talked about a possibility of decoupling. That is, that the developing countries were going to grow, even though the developed countries don't. That ended, as we've seen, because developing countries began to lose momentum. So the question really is it possible for the developing countries to grow faster without necessarily an acceleration in the developed world? Now, you know, one can take the view that growth in a developing country is really a combination of what you might call an autonomous growth capability, which is based on the supply side capability of the developing country, its investments, its human skills, and so on, all the supply side factors, plus the linkage potential of being able to link up with a more rapidly expanding industrialized world. It's quite clear that that has weakened. Now the question is, can this expand to offset the weakening? You know, you could actually argue, and this has not been argued too often, and may not even be politically correct in an international organization to actually put this forward. But you know, it's quite possible that if the objective is for convergence, that is that per capita incomes in the developed countries should converge with per capita incomes in the developed countries, it may even be logical for per capita incomes in the industrialized countries to stagnate for a while. And you know, this is directly connected with whether the planet can actually meet the resource requirements of continued expansion in both. So you might have a situation, you can conceive of a situation where you will not get an increase in incomes in the developed world. Now remember, we're talking about stagnating at, I don't know, $55,000, $60,000 a year. So certainly from the perspective of a poor country, that doesn't look like such a terrible thing to happen. Although it is true that, you know, in many of these countries, somehow the central unifying force in social terms tends to be an improvement in standards of living. I mean, it's frequently said that in the United States, a lot of the unhappiness, a lot of the distrust of the elites and all the rest of it is based on the perception that people now do not feel that their children are going to be even better off than they were. if they're at least as well off, in other words, it's a stagnant situation, you can imagine that somebody might say, well, look, this is a good enough level of income. Now we need a lot of other things, not material product, and that's what we're going to concentrate on. Now that requires a very different way of organizing society, and most of all, it requires getting away from the notion that everybody has to be working all the time, which is actually quite fundamental in the self-image in many, not all, but in many industrialized countries. But in order to be able to do that, in order to be able to tolerate higher levels of unemployment, you have to have a social system in which there are internal transfers, social security, this, that, and the other, which is actually much more commonly accepted in Europe and much less accepted in the United States. So while one can talk about it, it's not an easy thing to happen. But on the other hand, it's a relevant issue to ask that if convergence is going to occur, then maybe it needs to occur in an environment where per capita income growth in the developed world, industrialized world, actually more or less ceases while the rest of the world catches up. This is not exactly a sort of beggar my neighbor policy, but it does require a different way of looking at things. And I think the question to be asked is that possible? I mean, can developing countries manage without having the opportunity to export more and more to the developed countries? And to my mind, the answer is it should be possible. You know, many people say that the old, what used to be called the old export-led model is dead. And that's the model that was usually associated with the tremendous growth of China. Now, you know, the term export-led actually means export surplus-led, because that sort of is locked into an assumption that exports are contributing to demand, and the growth of exports is contributing to aggregate demand. Now, the point is exports can only contribute to aggregate demand if you're running export surpluses, which, of course, during a certain period, the Chinese were. If you're increasing exports and equally increasing imports, in net terms, exports and imports are not in net terms generating more demand in the system, because whatever demand is being generated by exports is leaking out through imports. So I think that what we need to think about is whether developing countries can retain an open trading environment, be very keen to increase the export share of GDP, along with an increase in the import share of GDP. So foreign trade is not a net contributor to demand in the system, but of course it is a net, it sort of globalizes the economy, leads to a transmission of technology and things of that kind. So this is really something at the back of my mind that I think needs to be explored, because I don't think we're going to be able to easily see a revival of rapid growth in industrialized countries for a whole number of reasons. And so either one accepts that if that's not going to happen, then we're not going to get much growth in the developing world also, or you have to move to a system where growth in the developing world is not dependent on growth in the industrialized world. Now, you know, in the old days, the developing world wasn't big enough, didn't have enough autonomous technical capability, etc., etc. That is really no longer true, in the sense that the size of the developing markets is now quite large. Asia, in fact, has become quite large. So there's really no reason to believe that if these countries were limited to servicing their own market, that somehow it just wouldn't provide the impetus needed for growth. So that's not in the presentation. Let's go back to the presentation. So this I've already talked about. So what are the policy challenges for an Asian emerging market or developing country? Well, first, that macroeconomic stability is always important, and especially in a globally integrated environment. And that is especially so in uncertain times, and these are very uncertain times. So any Asian country would be well advised to spend a lot of energy on making sure that the macro balance is right. This is very conventional advice. I mean, it's associated with the IMF and the World Bank, and I think it's true. And actually, internally, most of us recognize that. Whether we can live up to it in a practical matter is another thing altogether. But what does macroeconomic stability actually imply? Well, it implies a reasonable fiscal deficit given the overall debt service ratio or debt to GDP ratio. And I think there, probably Sri Lanka, like India, has too large a fiscal deficit and also too large a debt to GDP ratio. So one can imagine situations where there's lots of fiscal room. If one's fiscal deficit to GDP ratio was below 2% or something like that, and if the debt to GDP ratio was 40%, one could argue that, well, you have fiscal room. I don't exactly know the numbers for Sri Lanka, but I can tell you the numbers for India. And we're talking about a 6% general government fiscal deficit, and we're talking about 65% debt to GDP ratio. So by any standards, that would suggest that we have to, it's very clear what direction we have to move. And probably the same thing would be true of Sri Lanka. Second is having a manageable current account deficit given the likely stable long-term capital flows. Any deficit, if you're anticipating stable long-term capital inflows, there's no harm in running a larger deficit for the period that those long-term capital flows will exist. But each country makes its own assumptions on that. And certainly we in India have always felt that, 2% is okay and less than 2% is good for the current account deficit. I think we are there. Right now we're actually down to 1%. Sri Lanka is at about 2% or so. So that seems to, on the current account deficit, seems to be reasonably okay. But given the amount of uncertainty that exists in the world, to manage that situation, you probably need to have a lot of reserves. I think India is quite comfortable at the moment, although many of my friends tell me that these things are all very unpredictable. So in an open, we don't have an open capital account, but we do allow a lot of money to come in. And the essence of allowing a lot of that money to come in is that when the money you allowed to come in wants to go out, you shouldn't put any restrictions on it. So we don't allow huge surges to take place because we control the capital account, but you don't use those controls if there's an outflow from inflows that you yourself allowed. And that's where you need enough reserves, and I think India has a pretty reasonable reserve balance, $300 billion or so. Of course, a much larger economy. I know that in Sri Lanka it's $5+ billion, but that comparison shouldn't be a direct comparison. But I would say that on a comparable basis, Sri Lanka could go for a much higher level of reserves than it has now. So that's one. And of course, essence of macro balance is a moderate rate of inflation. So I think right now in India we are kind of coming down to our target, which is like Sri Lanka, we have a sort of some kind of flexible inflation targeting system. And the government has accepted a proposition that the Reserve Bank of India will aim its policy instruments at achieving 4% inflation plus minus 2. I believe in Sri Lanka you have a much narrower band. I agree that 4 plus minus 2 means anything between 2% and 6%. But people are really focusing on whether we're getting close to 4% or not. So that's the broad macro quantification. Now the advantage of this whole approach and rationalizing it is that the public should accept that this is a sensible target. And when I say the public, it means that when things go haywire in one of these dimensions, there should be a public pressure on the government to set that right. That takes a lot of sophistication in politics. I mean, for example, we talk about the fiscal deficit, but it's very rare, in India anyway, that the government is ever put under pressure by the public to reduce its fiscal deficit. I mean, I keep saying to my political friends that if they ever become finance minister and walk into the parliament and announce that we're going to have a quadrupling of the following 4 socially oriented and useful schemes, and as a result, I'm afraid the fiscal deficit is going up by 1.5% of GDP, they'll be wildly applauded. And maybe the pink papers and the Economic Times will put in a word of caution. But the politics doesn't operate in order to discipline the government on the fiscal side. So somehow, some combination of public opinion, internal mechanisms, checks and balances, etc., have to be deployed to achieve that. Now, let's suppose you've done the overall macroeconomic stability. And I mean, there are periods when almost all countries actually do achieve it. What is it that you should be doing to achieve higher growth? Well, one clearly, I would say as a priority, is one should be focusing on encouraging high rates of investment, and especially in infrastructure development. I think with the exception of China, which has over the last 20 years managed to invest a lot in infrastructure development, most of the other Asian countries have not done that. Certainly India hasn't. I mean, we're trying to do it and we keep talking about it, and we've even done something, but we haven't done anything like what we ourselves thought were our targets. And I would say that in this infrastructure development, one of the long-term areas where a lot more thinking is needed is urban infrastructure, because we're now at the stage where most of the Asian economies are growing quite rapidly. Certainly in India, we're going to see a much faster pace of urbanization. We're also globalizing, so there's, one of the consequences of globalizing is that inevitably what are globally accepted standards are immediately you expected to meet. And I compliment you all on the air quality of Colombo coming in from New Delhi, which is heavily polluted now. You can see that, you can't just ignore that aspect of infrastructure and expect to have a dynamic economy that's going to attract a lot of investment. So to tackle those problems is not just policy, it's also a lot of investment. People talk loosely of we must get away from personal transport, move to public transport. That involves a lot of investment in urban transportation, infrastructure, and all the rest of it. So that is a very, very crucial area that countries need to think about. So if you've got the macro stability right, and you manage to get the infrastructure development, then we get to the issue of economic reforms that will lead to a faster growth of total factor productivity. I think it's very important to emphasize that this whole search for reforms is important, but probably these 2 other things are important preconditions: getting macro stability, getting a high rate of investment. And I mean, finally, whatever you do, the growth process has to be inclusive and also has to be sustainable. The sustainability issue is now becoming a very top priority, even in public consciousness in India. I mean, I talked about air pollution, but for example, now you can download an app in New Delhi which tells you the air quality in 17 different parts of Delhi on your smartphone. 6 months ago, you couldn't do that. And I must have checked it 20 times. Now, it's one of those things, unless you get people aware that this is a problem, you can't expect to see much change. That's just an aside. Okay, reforms. Most of the discussions on growth focus on reforms. And, one problem is that in a developing country, certainly in a country at India's income level, I mean, Sri Lanka is twice India's income level, but even for Sri Lanka, because we're not really advanced countries, one can easily say that everything needs to be reformed. I mean, we're very far from the frontier in any area. But it's not very useful to have a whole list of things that have to be reformed, because that isn't the way of guiding policy. I think you need to define some key priority areas. And obviously these priority areas will vary from country to country. Now, of all the things that I've been reading in this, I thought that the growth diagnostics approach, which is pushed by people like Ricardo Hausman and Danny Roderick from Harvard, and I think Andres Velasco also. That's quite useful because it sort of looks at a country and superimposes on that country's circumstances an analytical process of identifying what are the critical constraints, as it were, the constraints which in the next 3 to 4 years will give you the biggest bang for the buck. Now, in any reform program, there's only a limited amount of political goodwill that any government can mobilize. So it's never a good idea to spend all of it doing little things everywhere. It's much better to spend whatever political goodwill exists on a few chosen things that will visibly produce a difference. Doesn't mean that it'll solve all problems. But if 2-3 years down the road, if you focus and said, look, this is what we need to do in order to achieve X, and X is important, there'll be lots of other people saying, well, and so is Y, and so is Z, and so is P, and so is Q. But if people have appreciated that the objective is important and what you're doing is going to achieve that objective, and 4 or 5 years down the road, you're able to say, well, look, we achieved that objective, now let's look at something else, I think that's a politically saleable and sensible way of going about things. So that is the growth diagnostic approach. Now, I don't know enough about Sri Lanka, but I was thinking, now what would be the right thing to do for Sri Lanka? You have an EFF arrangement with the IMF in which you have agreed on a whole lot of conditions, and I have to compliment the government, the Reserve, the central bank, for, I think, a very successful first review. At least that's what I read. The IMF board was quite pleased with the first review in November, was it? Yeah, just very recently, of the EFF arrangement. It's extremely important, in my view, that you continue getting these good reports. I mean, I'm speaking as someone who, we went in for an IMF arrangement 25 years ago, in 1991, pretty much the start of our reform, and it worked very well. And the truth is that when a country goes for an IMF arrangement, whatever you may say, other financial analysts look at the country's performance in terms of what it has agreed in that IMF arrangement, in the sense that the cost of failure on any one of those things can even be said to be objectively larger than it really deserves to be, simply because you've said this is what you're going to do, you've made it into a public commitment, etc., etc., etc. So very good that you had the first review. And I think if in Sri Lanka, I would not bother very much with too many other things. I've seen the list of, I think you call it the 6 pillars, isn't that right? 6 pillars of that EFF arrangement. That's a pretty good identification of priorities. And it's a 3-year arrangement, and if at the end of 3 years you're able to say that, look, we achieved all these things, or quite a bit of these things, I think you create credibility to move further. Now, having said that, let me now move to 3 different, I don't know, how much time do I have? Am I taking too much time? Okay. Let me move to 3 different things which I think are relevant for all of us, and I'll leave it to you to determine what is the specific lesson for Sri Lanka itself. And those 3 are, 3 questions, 3 broad areas. The first is, what are the implications of the current global economic environment for trade policy? The second is, what is the role of financial sector development? And the third, what are the important areas for global cooperation? All this is highlighted after having said that macroeconomic stability is important, infrastructure investment, etc. is important. So let's look at trade policy. I think this is clearly the area where people are most concerned at the moment. There is a threat of protectionism in the industrialized countries. It's a threat. It's not, hasn't actually led to huge increases, but one must be ready for them, although one should hope that it won't be as bad as we think. What does it imply? And the first question that has to be asked is that should developing countries give up on the traditional recipe of openness and turn inwards because the industrialized countries are turning inwards? Well, in my view, this would be a mistake. Protectionism elsewhere and I'm not saying that we will get a lot of it, but we may get a little bit, protectionism elsewhere reduces the payoff from following an open policy. It doesn't mean that a closed policy will yield better results. So the way I would look at it is that it's quite wrong if the industrialized world goes protectionist. It's actually wrong, as I will argue, for them also, but it certainly doesn't justify that we ought to be turning protectionist. That won't be a better strategy. So this is the first thing. Of course, I've said before that we shouldn't assume the worst. We will have some things, including on immigration, but maybe not as much as people are fearing. I think the key thing to remember is that it is not in the interest of industrialized countries to unwind globalization. I know that's the political rhetoric right now, but one has to hope that good sense will prevail. And I mean, those of us who live in democratic societies are very aware that during an election time, I mean, anything can be said. And you count on the system to somehow steady the ship a little bit later. It's simply not in the interests of industrialized countries to succumb to protectionism and to unwind globalization. And the reason for that is that they have a tremendous comparative advantage in the development of technology. I mean, some developing countries are also beginning to develop their own, and China is doing very well, India is trying to do a little bit, many other countries are they're getting further ahead, but they're nowhere near the capacity of the industrialized countries to advance technology. But this technology has to be ultimately embodied in some product. And secondly, that product cannot be destined for their own home market. It has to be destined for a global market. Now, the moment you accept that, the moment the logic of an industrialized country is to develop better technologies, embed them in better products, and then look for a global market for those products, then the logic of producing that product in the most cost-effective location will come in. And I don't think that a leader in the US erecting protective walls, raising the cost of production in the United States, will be doing US manufacturers any big favor. All that will happen is if the Europeans don't do that, they will be able to sell similar things much cheaper than the Americans will. So this basic logic that it doesn't make sense is likely to prevail. And I mean, for that purpose, for that reason, we ought to be ready to participate in that globalization process. Now, this is not a very popular thing to say at the moment because, there's a natural reaction. People say, well, they're turning protectionist, we should also turn protectionist. Sounds very reasonable. It isn't. So that's my first point. I think I have to accept that it's not as simple as that because in this description of globalization, the developed countries do have a problem. I mean, in the sense that they have a tremendous comparative advantage on the high technology side. I mean, everybody has to do their own low technology stuff. Somebody has to cook the hamburgers and somebody has to serve the food in restaurants. So those kind of jobs will remain, and the high technology jobs will be there. But it does mean that there'll be fewer manufacturing jobs than somehow people have in mind. Now, that could be a regional problem, that could be an age problem, that could also be a skilling problem. They have to address that somehow. And any country that doesn't will just kind of fall back. What we are hoping is that in the industrialized world, there's enough mature realization that that's really the way to go, so that we don't cause huge amounts of damage across the board. Now, in any case, industrialized countries are not our only market. I mean, after all, in Asia, we have the advantage of being geographically located in a much more dynamic part of the world than elsewhere. I mean, you saw that in the numbers on the growth rates of emerging market and developing countries in Asia, sort of growing at whatever, 6%, maybe something like that. That's a pretty high rate of growth. And if you look at trade growth in Asia, that's also very substantial. So The logical thing for Asia to do, in my view, would be to regionally integrate and remain open within this region. And I think if we do that, and we're nowhere near having done enough of that. So if you were to look at the internal barriers to trade within the Asian region, there should be a lot of leeway in order to get rid of these barriers and to promote greater trade. That does require a kind of visionary leadership. And we have some of that, but it's not as strong as, in my view, it should be. But hopefully there is the Regional Economic Cooperation Partnership Agreement, which is being negotiated. Because the Trans-Pacific Partnership looks as if it's reached a bit of a dead end, I don't know if it gets revived, but in the short run, nobody thinks that it's going to happen. Then the Regional Economic Cooperation Partnership Agreement becomes a very important signal to the world that Asia, at least, is not moving backward. And I think an open Asia gives a lot of opportunity for people to be developing successfully down a more open path. So I think Asia is not turning protectionist, and therefore that's another reason why Asian countries should remain open. A related issue here, which is much discussed amongst academics, is the whole question of should you follow an open but passive policy, just lower tariffs and free up trade and then expect that everything will be wonderful? Or do you have to have a more active but open policy? That is, you're trying to integrate with the world, but the government has to do a lot of support. Now, it's a no-brainer that everybody would say the latter. The question is, and that comes into the whole question of industrial policy. This is controversial because different people's definition of industrial policy differs. I mean, some people think of industrial policy, they have in mind, Japan in the 1970s or Korea, picking some winners and then in the private sector and giving them a lot of support and then somehow making them competitive. Governments are not very good at picking winners, most of all in a world that's becoming quite complex. I mean, governments are usually 20 years behind the private sector. So I would have absolutely no faith whatsoever in government picking a winner. I mean, there are winners, like for example in India, the government didn't pick the software sector. During the period when the software sector was incubating, and the real strength of India was quietly being built up. The government was still talking about, when I say, I was in government, so I know. We were still talking about we must, engineering, machine tools, etc., etc. Honest truth is that it's in the commercial world, in the areas where people are close to markets, that they can sense what the possibilities are. And any bunch of civil servants or politicians doing that is extremely unlikely. But there are some general things that government has to do, and one of them is, I think, identifying the likely areas, not very precisely, but the likely areas where the country might do well, and simply making sure that all the infrastructure needed for that is in place. You don't need, for example, my guess is that around about the early 80s, we were aware in India that, the software thing could become quite important. But, instead of focusing on how we can help this company and how we can help that company, the important thing was to lay out all the infrastructure which would allow the software guys to bandwidth and access and all of that. That is something governments can do. That's true of tourism. If you decided that tourism is a great potential, even though you don't know which company is going to break through, etc. There's an infrastructure without which tourism is not going to develop, and that's what the government should be working on. So in this way, focusing on the infrastructure for the areas of comparative advantage and defining those areas dynamically, not what is going on right now, but what do you think to happen, what do you think is likely to happen 10 years or 20? That's something I think governments can do. So that kind of approach to an active, open policy makes a lot of sense. Now, in some cases, the support becomes very industry specific. I mentioned, for example, bandwidth and connectivity and telecoms for, say, software development, and some infrastructure is much more general. But, you know, depending on the particular country, one can imagine some effort being made on one, some effort being made on the other. So much for trade. Let's look at financial sector. This is, to my mind, very crucial. I mean, I talked about investment earlier. But, you know, investment only happens if the financial sector can deliver to companies capable of doing the investment the financial resources that are needed for that investment. And here, you know, it's an anomaly in my view that Asia is a continent of high savings rates. But the financial sector in Asian countries is typically underdeveloped. And it's particularly weak in providing finance for new businesses. I'm really saying that about India, but I suspect that's true also for most of the other countries. So I think that if we are thinking of growth with high total factor productivity, the more efficient firms expanding, we need a financial sector that is capable of discriminating among these and making sure that enough resources go into these areas. So that development of that financial sector should have a high priority. Again, one should distinguish between infrastructure, need for finance, the need for finance for established industry which wants to expand, and the financing needs for smaller units and new startups. Now, these require very different kinds of initiatives. In the case of infrastructure, the most important thing is really twofold. I mean, long-term finance, these are projects with 30 years or so life cycles. And secondly, domestic currency finance. I mean, the worst thing to do is to have infrastructure finance through foreign borrowing, because these are typically projects whose revenues are in domestic currency. And I mean, ports are different because ports can conceivably have revenues that are dollar denominated, but most other infrastructure would have to have revenues that are domestic currency denominated. So you need some way of transforming the available savings into longer term maturities and domestic currency denominated. You know, in India, one of the problems we have is that the banks have been too much into the infrastructure area. And there's a complete asset liability mismatch there. But there's no point in banks which have short-term liabilities relatively taking on long-term assets. So this goes into the whole complex of the structure of the financial sector. Either we go in for long-term development finance institutions that can provide long-term loans, or you build up a strong independent insurance sector which actually puts a lot of money into these high-quality corporate bonds, which also raises the issue that there's a lot of legal infrastructure that has to be developed in order to create credibility in the corporate bond market, provisions regarding bankruptcy, etc. We're now doing that. But, you know, passing laws is one thing. Then you have to make the regulations for those laws. Then you have to build the institutions. So it's a long-term process. But in my view, progress in those areas is very crucial, and I suspect that much the same would be true in other Asian countries also. I think I've already talked about providing more finance for industry and so on. But you know, one aspect of financing which is now quite important, and that is that, you know, inclusive development, which we all talk about, calls for much greater financial inclusion. And that's an obvious area where we don't have that. I mean, at least in India, we've, in the last 2-3 years, had a big effort at increasing the degree of banking. Number of people with bank accounts has increased substantially. I mean, the previous government did some of that. The present government is also doing more of that. So there's been a big increase in that. But I mean, how much of that is actually at the moment translated into savings being intermediated through these things is an open question. But you know, at the same time, technological developments have made a number of things possible. And I think you need regulatory innovation. I mean, our Reserve Bank has to recognize that technology is moving ahead rapidly. Many tech firms, IT firms, are very keen to get into the whole payments business using new technology. And generally, the existing banks are actually an impediment because banks love money deposited with them. It gives them a float. It is a source of income. And so they're not very happy with all these new fellows scurrying around and trying to take away business. I think we have to see whether it isn't a good idea. I think it is a good idea, actually, to allow more of this competition and put pressure on the banking system. And I think this is an area where Asian countries should exchange experiences quite a bit. I mean, Bangladesh has done quite a lot in microfinance. We've also done some in microfinance. I'm sure that you're doing the same. Indonesia has done a lot. So I think this is an area where Asian countries ought to be pooling their experience. And regulators, like the central banks, need to look at what's happening to see, I mean, to benchmark themselves against the best of what's happening in Asia. Whatever has worked needs to be supported and spread laterally. And now the last slide. I thought, given what's going on from an Asian developing country perspective, what can we say about areas for global cooperation? Now, global cooperation is very important because we've all become globally interconnected. I mean, if countries were not globally interconnected, then there's no need for global governance. There's just need for country governance. But the moment you get globally connected, what one country does impacts on another, and you can only move to a sensible way of handling that if you have in place systems of global governance that evoke trust. So I want to make a few comments on trade, on finance, and climate change. I think on trade, we've already discussed. There is a real danger of regression in this area, which would be very unfortunate. I would emphasize that we should not assume the worst. We'll know soon enough. But the notion that the global trading system doesn't need to be strengthened, that it is damaging industrialized countries, is just wrong. It's based on misreading the reality. It is true that the global system is causing the developing countries to catch up. But then we should be very clear. I mean, do we want that or we don't want that? So frankly, for all the reasons why globalization is disliked in industrialized countries, it should be liked in developing countries. Because from our point of view, it's helping to bring about convergence. It's not doing that, by the way, for every country. Let's be clear about it. Many of the commodity exporters still have a sort of a roller coaster ride. But for most of the Asian countries, globalization has contributed to a closing of the inter-country inequality gap. It has led to an increase in the intra-country inequality, both in the industrialized world and also in our own countries. And we need to address that through domestic policy, not by canceling globalization, which is the same thing that I think they have to work out. So that's on trade. International finance. Now here, quite frankly, if we're talking about development finance, I'm not now talking about emergency finance, you're getting assistance from the IMF, which is good. I think development finance has run into a low-level equilibrium. I just want to give you one piece of, one data point. When people look at what are the challenges of, let's say, sustainable development, the sustainable development goals and so on, they all say that, look, in order to achieve these goals, the developing countries will have to invest an additional, I'm talking about additional now, some people say $1 trillion and some even say $3 trillion a year. Now let's forget the $3 trillion for a minute and just talk about $1 trillion a year extra. So where is this going to come from? Obviously, a lot of that will have to come from domestic savings. A lot of that will have to come from private flows, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of challenges there. But the simple calculation is that, up to now, approximately 40% of the investment in infrastructure in developing countries used to be done through the multilateral development banks. Okay? Now, if 40% of $1 trillion has to be financed by multilateral development banks, that's $400 billion. Maybe not 40%, maybe 20%. That's $200 billion. The present level of investment through the multilateral development banks, all of them, is about $40 billion. So, this is the challenge. Can you close that gap between the 40 billion, which they are doing at the present moment, and then the additional amount they have to, of 200 billion? Yes, we've got a new bank, the BRICS bank. Yes, we've got a new bank, the Chinese bank. But these are all small players if you look at these numbers. These numbers, if they are to be achieved, will require nothing short of a complete revalidation of a mandate by the major shareholders of the major multilateral development banks, both the World Bank and the ADB. At the moment, I'm afraid there is no consensus whatsoever in moving in that direction. I mean, probably the industrialized country view, when you push for it, this is very common. They'll say there's no shortage of money. The only shortage is of well-prepared projects and credible policies. But and that's true. I mean, we don't have enough capacity to produce these projects, and policies are also a little bit deficient, maybe more than a little bit deficient. But my point is that this is precisely the kind of market failure where a new mandate for the multilateral development banks could make a big difference. And their presence will actually enable developing countries to explore public-private partnership type arrangements where private sector also invests in these projects. And the reason is quite simple. The involvement of the multilateral development banks somehow increases the credibility of the government in sticking with the policies that it's announced. You can announce a wonderful policy, but the private sector will not believe that you won't change it. And remember, changing it means not changing it over a 30-year period. And too often, private sector people in all countries, including Latin America, have an experience that one government sort of announces a policy, then when there's a change of government, they change the policy. It's the presence of the multilateral development banks which somehow disciplines our governments. Not a nice thing to say for us, because you shouldn't want anyone else to be a disciplining influence on you. But market perceptions look at it that way. So in return for developing countries, as it were, being willing to allow these banks to participate as partners, the other side of the coin has to be that they have to put in a substantial stake in these investments. And that stake involves, as I mentioned all these numbers earlier, very, very big increases in the capital of these banks, which I hope the Indian finance minister and the Sri Lankan finance minister and the Indian governor and the Sri Lankan governor, when they meet in all these various meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, and in the Indian case, the G20, this is something we should really push. I should mention, by the way, that I used to be the Indian Sherpa for the G20 process, and in Seoul, which is 2012 or something like that, this was actually said that the World Bank should come back to the G20 with a concrete proposal on what can the MDBs do to facilitate this kind of expansion. Now, at that point, these numbers were not known. This comes out of some work that Nick Stern has been doing, connected with the SDGs. But these numbers are huge. And so far I don't think there's been a feedback from the MDBs. And that's basically not a fault of the management. I mean, the MDBs only respond when the major shareholders say, well, look, what are you doing about this? But the signal they're getting from the major shareholders is, forget about it, nobody's interested. So how will that change? That's a very big challenge that we have to face. On climate change, to be honest, I have nothing to say other than that is hugely important. We had a very successful meeting in Marrakesh, but in everybody's mind, the real question is not Marrakesh. The real question is how much of what has been said during the US presidential campaign will get translated into action. Because the honest truth is, the US being the largest economy, not today the largest emitter, but the second largest emitter, unless the US actually gets into the act big time, the whole climate change thing will lose momentum. Now, the present situation of climate change is really the following. We're very pleased, all of us, very pleased with the Paris Declaration and the commitments. They do mark a change because, for the first time, instead of simply arguing about what I have to do and what you have to do, all the countries developed and developing are on the same page. But the truth is that if we all actually achieve what we've promised in Paris, and then progress thereafter up to the middle of the century continues only at the same rate, we are nowhere near achieving the goal of limiting global warming to 2 degrees centigrade. We are on track for 3.5. And that kind of temperature hasn't been seen for 5 million years, I'm told, way beyond human experience. So how disastrous it will be, we don't know. Now, the only good news is that it doesn't matter if we don't do anything today, as long as we do something pretty soon. But, the scale of what needs to be done can be summarized by the following. To stabilize temperature, you have to get to zero net emissions. Okay? I mean, if the cumulative emissions keep increasing, then temperature will keep rising. So whatever level you sort of want to stabilize temperature, at that around then, the world has to reach zero net emissions. So far, it's not even reduced its net emissions. And we're talking about, 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide, whatever it is, per capita or something, I forget, 50 tons per capita. All this has to get down to 2. And what is more, it has to get to 0 by 2080. It's not going to get to 0 unless the industrialized world moves very rapidly towards that objective. My feeling is that if they do, then there'll be lots of pressure in the developing countries to follow suit. But if there's no movement there, I think movement here will also stop. So that's not a very nice note to end on, but let me just say that, nobody thought, my friend Nick Stern, I asked him, saying, look, can you say something positive about Marrakesh? And he said, Kyoto took 6 years to ratify, and the Paris Agreement was ratified in 10 months. So that's progress. And I think that is progress. So, but the important thing is time's running out. We need to move very rapidly in many new areas, and these areas are not yet in the public. No political leader has excited the minds of his public that this is a worthwhile task to achieve. And unless we do that, it's going to be difficult. Well, thank you very much.